Today's presentation will be given by Marta Hanson, Professor of the History of East Asian Medicine in the Department of the History of Medicine, Johns Hopkins University. She's been there since 2004. Her book is entitled Speaking of Epidemics in Chinese Medicine, Disease, and Geographic Imagination in Late Imperial China. It was published in 2011, and I might mention it was a paradigm-shifting book to trade in history of science cliches. She is currently writing a book entitled Heaven and Earth Are Within One's Grasp, The Healer's Body as Technology in Classical Chinese Medicine. So she's promising that we're getting some exercise this morning. So I'm excited. Okay. This book uses evidence from the 7th to 17th century to illustrate how Chinese healers instrumentalized their bodies as mnemonic aids, timekeeping devices, calculating devices, and medical instruments before instruments became considered to be external to physicians' bodies, calculators, and calculators substituted for our brains, and computers became surrogates for our memory in the modern period. She was senior co-editor of the journal Asian Medicine, Tradition, and Modernity for 5 years, and she is currently president of the International Society.
You can stop now.
I can stop now?
Yeah, you can please.
Am I embarrassing you
yes,
too much?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so
way too much.
I'm going to shut up.
You can just please cut.
Okay.
And you're going into my time. I'm sorry. Thanks. Yeah, I was going to start to go red on that one or something. Not totally unnecessary. So first of all, thank you, Miranda, for a really great introduction, but especially for inviting me out here in the cold of winter when it's so icy. And related to that, thank you all for actually making it here on such a, well, it's not so cold, but pretty hazardous environment out there with all the ice, which I, of course, promptly fell on. But I had a nice young gentleman pick me up with the surrounding undergrads, helping the old lady make sure she got on the way. So I'm not going to have you do any kind of exercises like that, but I am glad you all came with your hands, because I am going to ask you to indulge me in two things. One, actually using your hands for a pretty basic divination, a divination technique that got me going on this project in the first place. And the second thing is so one is physical, like I'm going to actually try to explain to you how this divination technique works. And then we're going to do a divination for this moment at this time that I hope will be directly relevant with whatever's going on with you right now at this time. You'll see what I mean by that. And then the second thing is to pay attention to what's going on in your mind. And what I mean by that is I'm really excited to talk with such a wide range of people here. For one thing is that I want to mine as much as I can from you about what I'm going to present to you brings up for you in your mind. And if you don't have a chance to ask a question, I'm going to be taking notes right now. Right? I would like you to introduce yourself so I can jot that down, and I'll do my best to answer them, but I would like you to also talk to me afterwards or send me an email if there's something that comes up that you think is an interesting example related to what I'm talking about generally. Because right now I've drafted the book manuscript, have my chapters worked out, and I'm working on an introductory chapter called Thinking About and Thinking with Hands. So the distinction is how we use hands to think about lots of different things, like how there's mental labor and manual labor. It's a major binary in society, right? Those who work with their hands and those who work with their minds. So history to that. We think about the hands as, some people think about them as in chiromancy or palmistry, as a window onto the individual's fate, right? Then there's something very different that's thinking with hands. That is a lot of examples where people really use their hands. Well, they use their hands to count with. You might do that, kind of count with simply. But there's some of the techniques I'm going to show you today are really about the hand being one with the mind to do complex memorization, calculation, and divination, and what I would call in cognitive science, what they call in cognitive science, extended reasoning. So that's the broad ambit of what I present to you today. I'm going to start with, I'm going to talk to you about three things. One, this divination revelation. Two, my original frame. And three, the expanded frame of the book project. Never been in such a classroom like this. So that's the original frame. And then I'm going to talk to you about the expanded frame. So I first was introduced to this phenomenon of using the hand to do cognitive things in 2001. So I'm going to talk to you about that moment, and we're going to do a divination. I'm going to explain the divination. We're going to do the divination. Then I first thought about it in terms of arts of memory. I'm going to give you some examples of that, what I mean by arts of memory. And then now I'm thinking about it in terms of the body as technology, which is in the title of my book. So first of all, divination and revelation. So I was preparing a presentation on the diagrams that are used in 16th century China to summarize pretty complex ideas about epidemics and how to predict them in 60-year cycles for this conference that was held in Collège de France. And these are some of the excuse me, tables I was working on. I was really interested about how the complex kind of processes that were related to temporal concepts like 10 heavenly stems or the 12 earthly branches. And here we have two examples of the 5 phases in a conquest and I've got the other one term, 2 types of ways they relate to each other. And on the left side, a summary of 60-year cycle and how these stems and branches map in 60 unique pairs to mark those 60 years. And just above that, a poem, rhyme verse. So starting in at least the 14th, 15th century, rhymes, medical texts were being rhymed. A lot of technical literature was put into rhyme so people could easily memorize it. So I was really interested in how people were using these tables at the time to learn these doctrines and how the complex kind of doctrines were versified. That's what I was planning to present on. My questions were what, texts had a lot of images and diagrams, who published them, what did the image do that was different from the text, how did they visualize these ideas of Chinese epidemiology, which I ended up writing my first book about, and then how did they actually relate to clinical actions? So these are the questions I was planning to discuss at this meeting in Paris. And on August 12th, something really extraordinary happened. But first of all, let me tell you where I was and what happened. So I'm at the Institute for Advanced Study. I was under the wing of Ben Ellman, who some of you know. I was working on my first book. I had an external fellowship. He let me come in and his research group to work on it. And I had a friend coming from Taiwan. She was at Taiwan National University and coming into Newark Airport. And I went out with my Cutlass Sierra Oldsmobile. My grandmother gave it to me. And going out out of Princeton to go pick her up. And I heard this strange sound in the back of my car. So I pulled into the to the local garage, and the guy said, "You are not going to make it to the airport with that. You've got your exhaust pipe is dragging on the ground." So I left the car there. I walked across wasn't that far back to where I was, across the golf course, and I waited for her to call because in that time we didn't have these cell phones. Okay? I didn't have that kind of thing, and I wanted her to catch the 10:30 bus to make it to Princeton instead of waiting at the airport several more hours. So, behold, she called pretty shortly after, and I could tell her to come, etc., and then everything worked out really smoothly. And then the next day, we're at the Guest Library, which is a really fabulous collection of East Asian works, one of the best in the country. Big wooden tables, not like these tables here, but big wooden tables across from each other. And suddenly I thought, why did you call me so soon? And you must have called me right at the gate. And she said, "Oh yeah, I did." I'm like, well, if I was her, I would have, gone to the curb, picked up my bag, gone to the curb, and then, because I'm kind of slow like that, and then realized she wasn't going to come, and then gone find a telephone booth or something. But no, she called right then. She said, "Well, I did a calculation on my hand. I did a calculation. I landed here, and it wasn't the worst prognosis, but it wasn't the best either. So I knew something had come up, that you had an accident, but that I should call you." Oh, I was completely perplexed. I had no idea what she was talking about. So she wrote this on a Post-it, which I've enlarged here for you, which I have to say didn't clarify things much more. Is that really a birthday? That's the lunar But I won't know, it's lunar, sorry. Good, I can take a little break here. So then she explained to me that she uses 3 numbers, and it has to be the lunar month, the day, and the hour according to the Chinese calendar of 12 hours a day, 2 hours each. Or she individualizes it, which is really interesting, by using the first character that comes to her mind. And of course, we know that Chinese characters have unique stroke numbers, at least the complex ones. And she uses that as a way of individualizing the prognostication. And each number starts at the place that you land on for the previous number. You have to think about this as a game. There are always constitutive rules of games and cultural rules of games. Like you play tennis, there's certain rules of how you play tennis, but then there's ways you need to behave when you play tennis that are not constitutive. So these are constitutive rules of this game. You start on da'an, which is the lower left part on her ring finger there, and you go clockwise around the hand. So this is where she wrote out the lunar month and the day. So how does this relate to astrology? There's different ways of classifying astrology according to the temporal units used. So natal astrology has to do when you're born. And hemerology is a study of calendars according to inauspicious or auspicious days. It's a little different. But electional astrology is about, what happens in the future, trying to predict an outcome for a future event. Horary, relating to hour, the exact time, relates to when the question is asked. So at the moment it's asked. Sometimes it's about when a disease occurs. So now this is the time I'm going to ask you to indulge me. Take out your hands, please. At least you could use your left or you could use your right as she uses. I prefer my left. And I'm going to talk you through the logic of the prognostication. So you start with, we have here in her numbers 6, 24, and the stroke number was 9 at the time, okay? But first of all, let me just talk you through these prognostications. So they're organizing according to relatively good, which is the peak here, and relatively bad, which is the valley, okay? And relatively, the best of the good is the feng shi, okay? And then the next level is the xiaoji. And then the least good of the 3 good is da'an, okay, which is where she landed. So that's why she said it wasn't the bad prognostication, but it wasn't one of the best ones. So she called me. Now, of the ones in the V, the worst one is Kongwang. So that's paired, as you see, lower of the best prognostication. And then the next worst is Chirkou, this one. And then the least worst is the Liulian, okay? So if we follow what she did, okay, there's another way of simplifying things too. So if we do, let's do 6, okay? We start at da'an. So everybody go da'an, Liulian, feng shi, Chirkou, xiaoji, right? And Kongwang. We land there, right? Everybody following me? Okay. Now, 24 days, that's a lot of times going around and around and around. Okay, so there's a way of summarizing that, into reducing it to a manageable number. So a full round is 7, and then another full round is 6. So you go -7, -6, 6 equals 5. Okay, so we're at F, and we're going to go 5. So go da'an, liulian, feng shi, Chirkou, and we land on xiaoji. Okay, everybody with me? Following? Great. Then there is 9 strokes. So we know that, excuse me, now one full circle is 7, which is equals 2, and we go just forward 2, we land on da'an. So that's what she did, right? And then we'll see that that's on the peak side of things, but it's not, it's on the least good of the good. All right. Now, now I'm going to go, what is happening here? The way it's portrayed is that this kind of divination method puts the individual person or the querent into the cosmological temporal order, right, and aligns them with that cosmos in this macro-microcosm model. I'm going to posit that it's a form of extended cognition in cognitive science, and just give you an introduction to some of the people that, I went ahead of myself. Andy Clark, you might have read an article he wrote in 2017 in the New Yorker, putting forward his ideas about this, but he and Chalmers are really famous for an example about an Alzheimer's patient, hypothetical, named Otto, and a woman named Inga. So Otto uses a notebook to remember where he's going. He takes a notebook wherever he's going. So it would be like me trying to find the way from the executive suites here and needing to take my notebook with me, or the wonderful list that Ina gave me, for example. But in this case, he writes it down. But Inga doesn't need a notebook. So he says, well, how is that different? Otto is able to get to, let's say, this hall, but he just uses a notebook. And so that's an example of how a notebook is part of, using the hand in the notebook is part of your mind. It's extended cognition. But let's say another example is when what he calls incorporation of a tool or device versus the use of a tool or device. So the example he gives is of an ape using a tool, right? And at a certain point, the brain in neuroscience, the brain actually recalibrates so that the tip of the tool becomes part of the body. Right? They can feel, right? So I think this is really comparable to those of you who are in East Asian studies or who understand how the calligraphic brush is understood as an extension of the person's individual, right? Actually as qi, and their blood and qi going through the ink. But also acupuncture needles in Chinese medicine are very much understood as transmitting the qi of the healer and working with the qi of the patient. I would also posit that in fact, all divination techniques are forms of extended cognition, like Otto's notebook. But what they do is they allow you to have, through the ritual, time to think about what your question is and find an answer within yourself. What's the best course of action? So now we're going to go back to the technique. We're going to position ourselves right now, today, February 12th, first lunar month, 8th day of that lunar month. I use a simple calendar. You can find it online. You can even pull up an app on your phone these days. And then between 12 and 13, that time of hour is the hour of the horse, 7th hour. Let's go back. Now everybody can take out your hand again. But first you're going to take out your hand, but now I want you to go within your mind and think, what do you have a pressing question about? But nothing really serious, like, whether you're going to get married, or you're going to have a kid, or if you're going to move or change a job, something a little lower level of something, but you don't have an answer for it yet. Like maybe whether or not you should get that dog or cat. That was an example from last time I presented this. But all of us have something that we're not quite sure about, all right? So put that in your mind. You don't yet have an answer for, okay? And take out your hand, left or right, and you're going to start with da'an. So the rule is you start at da'an, and you just stay at da'an. That's number one. Then it's day 8, so we minus 7. You just go A to B. Now we're at Liulian. And the hour is 7, so you just minus 7. You stay there. It's pretty simple. That is in the V section of things. So it's comparable to da'an in that it's the least of the worst. Okay? So it's basically counseling all of us for whatever question you had in your mind, that you should be patient. Yeah, you should think about what you're going to do next. It's not auspicious. It's not a sure plan of action. You should be patient about it and wait until you have greater clarity about what to do, or maybe because this is not the best prognostication, you do have a clearer idea of what you should do in the situation than you had before you did the ritual of this divination. So that's what I mean by it's a form of extended cognition, or a way of of thinking through questions, and that we can apply that to divinatory techniques external to the body. In this case, this one's an embodied one. So there are other interesting things that come up in the illustration she sent me. The Xiaozhi Swan, which is sums up many techniques in which the fingers are used to calculate something or to divine something. And Ma Qian Gua. So this is a reference to Gua, again, of the Ba Gua. Of the Book of Zhou Changes. And Ma Qian is actually refers to Sangguo Zhi, Zhuge Liang, the general who actually in the Sangguo Zhi uses his hands to prognosticate how to proceed in military battles. So the earliest example of what my friend used on that August in 2001, I found in this kind of almanac calendrical collection of calendrical methods by the very famous Ming publisher, Xiongzheng Li. I'm going to move a little faster. And we have the 6 prognostications, 6 possibilities, and under each one, depending on whether you have a medical question or a work-related question, a career-related one, or family-related one, or et cetera, it has agricultural, it has a guidance of what you should do. And it continues to today. This is just an example I found at, at that time. And as I said, it's based on when the person asks a question, but I also found examples when it's based on when the illness began in some earlier Chinese medical texts. Now, what was amazing was I did not see, like within an hour, I found these hand mnemonics in the medical text I was using for this meeting in Paris. I didn't have the distinction of hand mnemonics at the time, so I didn't see them as relevant. I only saw the circles and mnemonics, etc. So hit this one and this one. Suddenly, like within the hour. That's why I say divination, revelation. It was really shocking to me that I didn't notice them. And then this essay is really the best essay I found, in which the author, Zhang Jiebin, relates these practices to yin-yang specialists, and lists them, and I found all of them in late Ming different encyclopedias, and he talks about micro cosmic relationships between the body more broadly, as well as the hand. So this one is on reading the pulses and situating the patient's pulse at that time, just like we did the divination that was appropriate for this hour of the horse, into the year's seasonal pattern of this related into 6 stages into that 60-year cycle. So this is that technique, and this one is based on the 12 branches and is used to calculate the yearly pattern of weather and epidemics, determining whether it's a good or bad year for epidemic disease, in that sexagenary cycle. And then the inspiration of my book, Heaven and Earth Are Within One's Grasp, comes actually from this essay introducing this hand mnemonic, in which at the end he says, in one revolution within the palm, as for the 6 qi that divide up the year, understanding is within one's grasp. And I realized that what they're understanding are these larger temporal spatial concepts related to Qian Kun, or heaven and earth, Tian Di. And so the whole book that I'm writing about uses these techniques that I'm uncovering from the early medieval and early modern period to explain to people what were the operative concepts of heaven and earth that mattered in medicine at the bedside with the patient. And people can also use the book to learn how to do those techniques themselves. So the hand itself is really interesting, and liao ran zaiwo, that metaphor of grasping, is both conceptual and corporeal in English as it is in Chinese. I mean, even this famous book on metaphors we live by, I have a quote here where Lakoff and Johnson talk about how we understand things that are unknown to be up in relationship to our bodies and known to be down, like they give here, the matter is settled, that's up in the air, or the matter is settled, or I guess in modern speech someone might say, I'm down with that. And that when you hold something in your hand, it really fixes the location of it and is very comparable to this idea of understanding as grasping or knowing is down and unknowing is up. Which brings me to think about how the hand is used in metaphors for Chinese texts, very much in the way that it's used for primers, handbooks, manuals, Handbuch in German, in French and German and English language. And I particularly put these slides in here so that many of the people who work on East Asian languages and literatures can think about titles that they may be familiar with and I'm not familiar with because I work on medicine. That's the kind of thing I want you to pay attention to in your minds and send me an email or talk to me about it. Body metaphors, here you have Danqi's very famous Shinfa, so the heart, mind is a body metaphor about mastering of something, in this case essential methods. But also Zhu Danxi or Zhu Jianheng, famous physician, has another book attributed to him, which is called the Maizhi Zhezhang, or fingers and palms, if you take it nominally, or to point to the palm, to Zhezhang. And I'm translating it as handbook on pulse rhymes or the mastery of pulse rhymes, because if you have it within your hand, you mastered it, just like in that quote I made before. But also Zhinan, to point, and in Zhinan Zhen, compass, to point to one's palm, like Zhezhang means to master something. It also is used for what we would call in English manuals or handbooks. Manual, manus coming from the hand. I would translate this as diagnostic manual. And there are other titles. I'm not going to go on with this. I just wanted to put it out there, like Shoujian and Shoujing, a handheld mirror being used for kind of summaries of knowledge. So my research questions after that revelation really changed. What medical doctrines were written on the hand? How did the hand mnemonics relate to other diagrams? Where did they learn to use these mnemonics, in the hand as a mnemonic and calculating instrument, which I found was, my physician told me in the essay accompanying these diagrams, which was from yin-yang specialists. And then I was able to find so many of them in late Ming early in late Ming publications. And I found that it was a broader practice, and it was practiced elsewhere. So my original frame was this kind of thing. Anybody use their hands to remember somebody, right? And some people use the verse, right? So getting some nods. If you didn't have that example, you might have, in physics, learned Fleming's left-hand rule for left-handed mechanics or the right-hand rule for electric generators. Had anybody heard of the telephone keypad mnemonic? I made it up. But I use it all the time, actually. Actually, it was a technique I had as a child when we used from rotary dials to the keypad, and I would remember the numbers spatially. I still know my childhood number this way. And you can bring your hand out again. And so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It's so useful to remember telephone numbers, but even more importantly, flight numbers and gates, which if you travel a lot, you don't want to keep pulling your ticket out. So I often press there, or even now I just visualize where the numbers are and I remember it. Or I do A, B, C, D for gates and remember, I do it all the time. And I give it all to you as a gift if you like to use it yourselves. My present to you. Arts of memory. So lots of work in the European tradition on arts of memory, none of which deal with the body. They all deal with this very complex memory palace and other mnemonics and oral, but not on even despite evidence, as I found in the Shakespeare Library exhibition in 2000, which was really just the year before I was working on these, when I discovered this phenomenon. We have Guido's musical hand from the 12th century. Actually, prayers, some Catholic traditions use the hand for some spiritual exercises. We see that tradition carrying into some versions of Ignatius Loyola's very famous Exercitus Spiritualia, and then just strictly as a mnemonic device, and even the whole body with place numbers for memorizing even more numbers of things. I would even argue that the zodiac man in history of medicine in the West was a mnemonic device for remembering the order of the 12 zodiac. This is very interesting discussion of when European Memory techniques using architecture and space were brought to China in 1596 by Matteo Ricci. And what's really fascinating about this book is there's no discussion whatsoever of any Chinese techniques in the matter, either in the Matteo Ricci book or in Spence's book about it. Even though in the same year it was published, there's ample evidence of these techniques in the popular encyclopedias of the day. You don't see the transmission of this, at least that I found, until the late 18th century with another French Jesuit, Amiot, in which the 12 musical tones were translated. You can see directly from the Chinese original to French. Excuse me. So expanded frame. What do I mean by that? So first of all, this book was very important to me. It's the only, He Peng-yok is the only person who actually, at the time I was discovering this in Chinese literature, had used the hand to explain these very interesting, complex, and sophisticated divination techniques of the Chinese Astronomical Bureau called the Sanshi, the three cosmic boards. And these techniques were applied for weather, forecasting, political matters, human affairs. They're considered very secretive, but this is really the first treatise in English to explain how they worked, and he used hand diagrams to explain them, although he didn't use any illustrations of the hand at the time, at the Song or later examples, but he had used his own hands to work out these calculations. So that was a very informative book for me. But in the history of science, this book was the first to really look at embodying science and paying attention to how truth claims of scientific knowledge had been stripped away of all social, political, economic, and particularly bodily origins in the very people that had created them, like Newton and I'd list Boyle, other people like that, and they try to re-embody them and show that, re-embody the people that come up with the knowledge, although they don't actually show how the specific scientific knowledge was created through the bodies of these scientists. Another very important book for me is The Mindful Hand. And the reason why I find it really important is that he talks about this, they talk about the history of this division of mental and manual labor. As I introduced in the beginning of my talk, the distinction between episteme, knowledge, and techne, techniques, as a way of structuring the working world and society. And each essay brilliantly shows how manual labor and theoretical invention in the history of science and medicine were actually closely linked processes in specific cases. And they make a very interesting distinction between those who were a handy mind, right? So those who had the mind but were handy, and those who were represented with the mindful hand, like the artisans who also read texts and things like that. Excuse me. But again, no example of actually using the hand and the mind together and the kinds of examples that I was talking about. Other sources that have been really interesting to me and useful are books like this by Janet Gyatso, and the last chapter is about how important morality, medical ethics, and purification rituals for the efficacy of a physician, or to be even considered a viable healer to see in the first place. And there is a real history to the ethics of being human and the importance of integrating those within the doctor's training. But the body as technology as an analytic concept, I am very much indebted to the work of Projit Mukherjee on Southeast Asia and India, these practices in which the physician's body was considered to be a chariot with two wheels that combined the mind of knowledge and the body for practice, so in which the healer had to include the episteme and the techne together within his own body. And there's a very important notion of ritual purity that was integral to healing. So what does that mean? If the healer wasn't of moral standing and et cetera, he could be a blunt therapeutic instrument. But it was even more concrete than that. It meant evacuating the bowels, for example, making sure you were clean within. It meant wearing, bathing, performing ritual prayer, dressing consonant with one's social identity as a healer. In addition, the body itself was used as a timekeeping device. So this is before we have wristwatches or public clocks, right, external to ourselves. They used a rhyme comparable to MISSISSIPPI, which represents what? Anybody? Come on, you know. What? Yes, thank you. A second. All right, so I want to do one more. This is where I'm going to have you all use your bodies, not just your hands. I want you to balance your chi, so calm, you should be calm. And pay attention to one inhale and one exhale. So that's the temporal unit. What's a normal inhale and a normal exhale? You take your left hand, put your right hand here, and first just, I would close your eyes and see if you can feel your pulse at all. Like that. You can do it this way. The Chinese do it this way. Yeah. You can feel your pulse? I prefer closing my eyes. And see how many pulses within a normal inhale and exhale you have. Okay. How many did you have? 3? 6? 4? All right, so anybody else have higher than 6? Oh, I did. I had about 8 or 9. I'm so stressed out of here. The 3 or 4, 4 is normal. 3 is more yin, so slower, more stagnant. And those are the 6 to the 9, like me, are too young. Okay? So you can see how the body there, all of you just use your breath as a timekeeping device. And what's really fascinating is that Galileo did that. So did Kepler. But not their breath, they used the pulse. And here, for example, is a argument by Michael Seger that says, no, he didn't, there's no evidence that Galileo actually invented an instrument to count pulse rates. Rather, he used the normal pulse as the best measure of time. And in fact, when you look at his dialogue, there's many instances in which he uses pulse beats as a measurement. And some examples that Kepler, when he was doing astronomical observations, they would have a prostrate man to, have a regular pulse rate, and they would use the pulse rate of that person to track astronomical phenomenon. Now, the body as an diagnostic instrument has a history to it too, and so the Chinese came up with dividing up the senses into 4, and they also gave them, you could say, a kind of social hierarchy, comparable to the mental manual binary I talked about. So the eyes are to examine, listening uses the ears to divine, speaking uses words to inquire, palpitating, which we all just did, uses fingers to examine. But to understand by looking, so we're actually going ears, eyes, mouth, hands. So we're going top to bottom. Pay attention to that order, has a hierarchy. Then the looking is called the spirit, using the eyes to examine the 5 colors. So that's the highest. Listening is called the diagnostic technique of the sage, the next level down, right, with the ears. Understanding by asking is of the laborer. So we're getting now more to the manual technique side of things. Excuse me. And the palpitating, which we all just did, is that of the artisan. But the diagnostic techniques of the spirit, the sage, the laborer, and the artisan are all essential ways of examining illness, and it concludes that the healer must master all 4. So I would say this is very much about cultivating the healer's body as a diagnostic instrument. And then here we have the pulse advice, but also they use their bodies as measuring device, as instruments. So here we have the classic swin being, all of you have a swin here. Now that would be the best use for your own bodies. You'd have to adjust the swin locations of points according to the swin of the patient you're dealing with, because obviously people smaller and larger have different swin. It's a relative measurement unit. Excuse me. And here, going back to Pojit Mukherjee's idea about the body as technology, also encompassing how the healer must cultivate their form of comportment and ethics. We have a very late, I would say, in Chinese history, articulation of medical ethics. It's in the 7th century with Sun Simiao, Miao, in which he says, I like the last part, when a life is at stake, it is inhumane to be impetuous or to show off due to a desire for reputation, which clearly is a response to people doing just that. He also includes in one of his texts a use of palm formula methods. It's the earliest example I've had of this, and they were used for treating snake wounds and tiger bites, making someone eat his own voice, which I really like, and making appear, expel, or strike down demons. So it's very much part of exorcistic rituals. The earliest example I found of this kind of practice actually on the hand, illustrated on the hand, is from a mid-12th century text that Michel Strickman dates to the 7th century. And these talismans had to be created first, and then in order for the whole ritual to be effective, of course, the healer had to venerate and not defile the talismans, and then carry out ritual pressing of his fingers that would bring up his own qi, I guess, or spirits, and expel whatever demons or things he needed to do. This is a 12th century text, which is the earliest example I have of the hand mnemonics being used for predicting the 60-year cycles. And here is the 12 earthly branches that I introduced this talk with from the text in 1624. So what I found is that it's really in the 11th and 12th century that these ideas for predicting weather patterns and epidemics became and integrated into the Chinese medical texts at the time, and hand mnemonics were used by physicians. At least they were trying to teach physicians to use them for predicting the time that they examined the patient within these 60-year cycles. What I find interesting, too, is in this Song text, you have this diagram from 1624 text actually has its origins in this Northern Song text, published under Huizong. And this idea of Wu Yuan Liu Qi, the 5 circulating phases and 6 climatic types of qi, is a kind of narrative arc of my story where they first emerge here, they rise, they fall, and then they try to get resurrected, and my book ends in 1624 with the attempt to resurrect them. That's part of the narrative arc of the book. But in the same text, you also have still the ritual healing being used that I showed you before, where it's the comportment of the physician matters, and then they're using their fingers to expel demons, which is very different from the kind of numerology calculating of the previous example. Again, so for a ritual to be efficacious, the healer must, of course, embody virtue and be disciplined and purify, etc. Now I'm going to just end with this image. I'm going to talk to you about why it's so interesting and useful to me. It's the earliest image I have of someone doing this kind of finger divination, or what I call dactylomancy, which uses the Greek dactyl for finger, and mancy to divine. And you can see he's got his left hand up, and he's has a book, or kind of sticks before him in a book, and his right hand down. And what I want to capture is both the physical, what they're doing, what is he doing with his hand, what are the healers doing with their hand, they're borrowing from these traditions, and what's going on within their minds, and what is the larger social world in which that performance matters. What is the action they're taking? And I think that this relates to the point I made about bringing in cognitive science, Andy Clark's work on extended cognition, because I think, to me, that really helps me best understand the phenomenon in a larger frame, where the brain is understood to be in operation with the body in these cognitive processes. And in the history of science, 2 main authors that I found influential and have written on note-taking as a way of taking note have been Anne Blair and Lorraine Daston. So finally, I want you to think about scientific instruments for extending the eye, like the telescope, or extending the ear, like the stethoscope, as comparable to techniques of divination, as we see on the left here, because they are ways, in my argument, of extending reasoning, of helping cognitive processes, extension of the mind. So think about all these instruments that we've now deputized to carry out our cognitive functions, right? We have the old calculator, even the wristwatch, laptops, and I had to bring in the Palm Pilot. So thank you very much.
As we are recording today, I'd appreciate it if you use a mic for your questions, because that way your question will be able to be heard on the tape. Does anyone have a question for Professor Hanson? I'll start over here.
Great, thank you. We'll bring out my pen, take
in
notes.
terms of the astrology, the calculation is based on the Chinese lunar calendar, and it requires the exact date and time. So I'm thinking if you're gonna deal with someone who was in U.S. and something that occurred in the U.S., how do you take account the time difference?
Yeah, so there is debates in divination about how that matters, and there are tables for recalibrating things, and so there's arguments about that. It doesn't matter. They can just use, there are people pro and against that. But the bottom line, what I'm arguing is that it's the ritual that matters. The ritual itself there are rules of the game, yes, but what matters is just what I had you do, come up with something in your mind, then you follow the rules of the game using those coordinates. Now, and then think about what comes up to your mind after the prognostication has come up. That's the process that I think my friend, for example, who did it, why she still uses it, because she finds it useful for helping her think through a slight impasse, not major decision, but like a little doubt. She'll do that, and then something opens in her mind. She's able to make a decision more clearly than before. So in my argument, the temporal, that doesn't matter. But there are people who argue that it does matter if you want to get the best prognostication, and there are tables you can find online to get the right reading for the place you are located when you ask the question. So thanks for bringing that up. I appreciate it.
So these divination methods, is there any relation to the I Ching and the notion that because the question you ask and the method of the divination corresponds in time, and there's some mystical synchronicity of the two events that lead to this? My interpretation of the I Ching's effectiveness is that it's totally random. It generates a situation that you would not have considered, and it adds a completely different perspective to the development of the question and answer.
I think my argument applies directly to the I Ching. The I Ching gives you 64 archetypes and multiple readings and a couple centuries of commentary. So whatever question you bring to bear on the I Ching, you have ample things to work with to get greater clarity about what you're thinking. Has anybody read Philip Putman's The Dark Matters trilogy? Golden Compass. You've seen Nicole Kidman as the evil person in the Golden Compass? Do you know? You haven't read those? I guess it's so British. It's placed in Oxford, but and they're doing a series on it. But there's nobody. So there's an alethiometer, which the young 12-year-old girl can master. Have you? So you are not. You've read it. You've read it. You know what I'm talking about. So this is reading this novel because somebody I presented this and she said you need to read Philip Putnam. Now I don't normally read kids fiction, and certainly not fantasy fiction. I mean, I used to, but I don't anymore. But I read the whole thing. I couldn't put it down because the first one is about the alethiometer. And the thing about, and Philip Putman has definitely, he knows his Chinese philosophy, he's integrated into his narrative. And the alethiometer is like the I Ching, but it's not 64, but it's like 28 or something. And she's able to read, when she does it, at that moment she has a question, exactly, it's horary astrology, nodding my head, and I said that, and she's able to read the archetypes and then see within her mind what's the best solution when she's at an impasse. And it was really Philip Putman's alethiometer that made me realize what is really going on here. In my mind, the best way, I think, to interpret these phenomenon more broadly, not just from what my friend introduced to me, but even large. I would even argue that what the Chinese are doing in terms of situating the patient in 60-year cycles is a ritual that gives them thinking space to think about what's the best course of action to take therapeutically.
Yeah, thanks so much for this. So I had a couple of questions. The first question is I'm kind of curious why you stop in 1624. because it seems like there are a lot of modern resonances. So just as a historian, I'm just kind of curious. And I'm also curious about the starting point, because you talk about these diagrams coming out in the song. And if I remember correctly, it's also in the Song medical reforms that for the first time they're required to know the Wu Yun Liu Qi. So what I find really fascinating and important is that it seems to me to be a case where this new technology is developed in response to a particular intellectual project. And so I'm wondering if you have any sense of whether there were other choices for this technology that it ended up on the hand. Is there some reason why the hand was particularly suited for that? Could have there been some other thing? You mentioned it was borrowed from the yin yang. So I'm just really fascinated by the kind of larger historicity of why this particular choice. So thank you.
That's such a great question, of course. First, why stopping in 1624? I have 6 chapters. I think I think the publisher will publish 120,000 words. So I mean, it's in that logic of things. Even though I have, and the next examples in the Yizhong Jin Zhen, which you're working on, and things get really complicated with the shofa, and way manual labor is understood or valorized in a new way from your work. Actually, your work, I thought, well, I'll stop right before Ely's work takes off. I was one of my part of the calculus, actually. And I thought that, in the Wu Yun Liu Qi arc of things, Zhang Jiebin is trying to resurrect a theory by that time that has really lost favor. And even the Neijing itself, the inner canon, is definitely not the going bestseller of the period. It's these Jin Yuan doctors. And so he's using all the things available at the time to make this knowledge more accessible. In terms of genres, he uses jie, explanations. He uses gudre and kodre, rhyming schemes. He uses illustrations, and he uses the hands as techniques to try to get this, admittedly difficult knowledge to understand for his modern period. So I think for the narrative arc of Wu Yun Liu Qi, which is, that's an interesting place to stop, and also his hand diagrams are the most complex, and things don't really get more complex after that. So I just thought, well, I think my point will have been made by that point, and I'm going to just, those are 2 main reasons. You, actually, one, and second is it made sense for the narrative arc of this medical doctrine emerging, rising, falling, and trying to be resurrected. And it is, I just thought, by this time my readers aren't going to want to follow any more of this technical knowledge, because actually the one that looks the simplest, the 3 pulse readings on the top and the bottom, is really the most complicated to understand. I thought I'll conclude there. And the second point, just quickly, there's not a lot of reflexivity on the phenomenon. So getting at that question, I'm not sure I can do, but I think what you're getting me to think about is, when I set up what's happening in the song, is talk more broadly about the kinds of divinatory practice happening in the court, like with He Pengyok's book, in which I think that's a larger context. I can just draw it out more synchronically. Yeah, thanks. And wait, and then she wanted, after him, she wants to speak, yeah. Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead. I just want to make note to that she wanted to speak afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. No, I'm sure. I'm just saying. Yeah.
All right, let's stop wasting time. I'll just. I think I want to ask about handbooks, but I want to do it in a. All right, so.
You can just cut to the chase.
Okay, here we go.
I can take it, whatever it is.
So we know that in many parts of China, animal bodies have been used for divination, and still continue to be used for divination. Part of my question has to do with how you think about animal bodies as analogs of human bodies, as completely different from human bodies in another territory altogether. But also, there's something about the ways that characters are inscribed on the bodies and the hands in the
diagrams that you gave, and also the idea of a handbook as something that might be kind of analogous to a hand, but also inscribed with characters, that is giving a particular character to a human body in your materials. And I'm just wondering, does that extend in some way to animal bodies and divination and the way that characters in writing come out of, like, say, scapulomancy? I realize those are a bunch of mixed thoughts.
No, those are really big questions. The first one about animal bodies reminds me of Connie Cook's new work, because she and I are in conversation about the body and divination, and just organized a panel together. And so she's arguing that in some cases, she's reading the turtle plastron as an analog for, as you say, for the king's body. Now we can go into another territory, because I would call it a proxy body. Yeah. And I think of these practices as going a spectrum from completely embodied, like these hand mnemonics I'm talking about, to proxy embodied, to disembodied. And things get disembodied. Like the hand becomes completely irrelevant once you have it in your mind. You can just do things in your mind with it, and you can think. So that's a disembodied, like this numerology. But the proxy bodies would be like an acupuncture needle, of course, as I said before, but also the planchet for doing divination writing. Why is that material important? Or I with Michel Strickman's work, and then the Janguli text, the ensigillation, which is therapeutic sealing on the skin of the patient. That's the material is always very precious wood. Right? And I consider that material like being a proxy body, because it's also its efficacy is dependent on how the healer's own body, that's embodied, then the ensigillation and stamping on the skin of the patient, but also on paper that's embodied by the patient internally. And then there's kind of disembodied things, like you could say the chanting, which gets transferred and then isn't disembodied, then gets embodied. But there's this proxy body in so many rituals, and I consider I would consider the turtle plastron as a kind of proxy body. But I think in the rituals of moving from embodied to disembodied, but also as an analog for king.
So this might be a very naive question, but I wonder if you have looked at how the use of hands have influenced the use of language and also shaped language itself. I remember being told by my math teacher that one of the reasons why we have the basis of 12 in Indo-European languages is that we used to count 1, me, 2, you, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then 12. So we had the fingers were used to count the sort of plus, so up to 12. And all the pictures you're showing us are using units of 5 or 10. And apparently the word for two in Indo-European languages are related to the word you, thou, do, tu. Is that a productive way of thinking about the body as language?
Right. Actually, people in anthropology have done a lot of work on that, especially in ethno-mathematics. Your intuition is spot on. Let me just say that. And some people, yes, 10 with the hands. Actually, Zhang Jiabin's essay unpacks the hand and so it and the body. So it is first 32, then 64. So it aligns with the Book of Changes numerology. So the body is very explicitly linked with temporal units and spatial units in just that one text that I showed you, 1624. So actually I have a lot of stuff on ethno-mathematics just on that topic and cultures all around the world. So thanks for that point. That goes in my thinking about, but thinking with the hand, because that's about how the hand generates different numeracy and numerological systems.
Okay, physicists and many other people believe that the universe is a hologram. To me, these divination and diagnostic techniques might be useful and relevant because of the holographic nature of reality. If in a hologram, the whole picture is present any way you look. If you have the technique for seeing the whole picture, I mean, skull pulmoncy, even any type of tarot cards, any type of diagnostic or astrology, they're all based, they seem to me to be dealing with the basic aspect of reality, and if they have relevance and use, it's because of the holographic nature of reality.
Okay, thanks for that insight. I think that's certainly how people who use them understand them.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm adding another layer, which is I think that I'm really situating it in this extended cognition dimension of cognitive science as tools for facilitating people to think through questions that they need answers to.
Well, it
So that's another layer.
It doesn't nullify that.
No, doesn't nullify. I acknowledge that's exactly. I think
Right,
I would
right.
say you're spot on.
Okay,
Good
thank you
intuition.
very
Yeah,
much.
that is how they understand it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have time for one more question. Anybody? Any other questions? Oh, okay.
You mentioned two things about the Matteo Ricci and the memory palace.
Yeah.
That number one, the Chinese already had such memory techniques, and two, that there's no mention of it in that recent book, the Memory Palace of Matteo Ricci. Was Ricci under the impression that he was giving the Chinese something entirely new that they weren't experienced with?
Yes, indeed. And what's really interesting is that it did not go far at all. I would say it was a failure on all accounts. I mean, it did get printed, but it didn't sell. Nothing like his book on friendship, which was a major success by the standards of the day, because they could understand the importance of friendship. But they thought that the techniques that he was trying to convey to them about situating people or ideas or characters at different pillars in an imagined palace, and then having them do really extraordinarily strange things, was far more complicated than was necessary to actually know those characters. And he was using simple characters too, like new, and I could understand why. I mean, for the character for woman or for peace, or you can understand why the Chinese were like, this system is far more complicated than just to memorize these basic characters that they've known since they were kids, right?
Before it was published, he handed it to one of his friends who was a magistrate who had 3 children, and with the idea that it was a gift to them so they could prepare for the civil exams.
Yeah, that's just
and they said, no, we didn't use
exactly. So you know better than me. You know perfectly well it was a failure, yeah. So I just find that an interesting heuristic to bring up, that he's trying to bring, this very elaborate, complex arts of memory that's really well studied, as I showed you, in the European tradition, and it just hit a wall, And we actually, I would put out there, we don't have good work on the arts of memory on the Chinese own terms. I just have a very thin sliver that I'm looking at of the phenomenon. Thank you all for coming out on a day like today.